Is that some kind of prop around your neck, sir? Or are you trying to make a statement in my courtroom? The judge's voice cut clean through the stale, recycled air, sharp as polished steel and just as cold, and every head in courtroom 3B turned at once toward the old man seated at the defense table, where Martin Hale sat perfectly still in his worn wheelchair, his hands resting loosely on the armrests, as if they had been there for years, as if they had learned the discipline of stillness long before this room, long before this judge, long before any of it. And yet the small ribbon and medal hanging against his chest seemed to draw all the light in the room, a quiet defiance against the dull fluorescent hum overhead, while Judge Richard Whitmore leaned forward over the bench, his robe folding neatly around him, his expression carved from impatience and something sharper beneath it, something that mistook authority for certainty, and he tapped his pen once against the wood, a crisp, deliberate sound that echoed farther than it should have. "I asked you a question," he said slower. Now, each word measured like a warning, and the bailiff shifted his weight near the aisle, leather creaking softly, while a few spectators exchanged glances that hovered somewhere between curiosity and discomfort, because there was something off about the scene, something that didn't fit, like a note just slightly out of tune. But no one spoke. Not yet. Not here. And Martin Hale finally lifted his eyes, pale blue, steady. The kind of gaze that didn't rise to meet confrontation but absorbed it, as if it had already seen worse and filed this away as something smaller, something manageable. And for a moment he said nothing, and that silence stretched, not empty but full, heavy in a way that pressed against the walls, until the judge exhaled sharply through his nose, irritation breaking through the polished surface. "Let me make this simple," Whitmore continued, leaning back now, one hand resting on the bench as though claiming the entire room with it. "This is a court of law, not a stage, not a memorial, and certainly not a place for theatrical displays." His eyes flicked again to the medal, dismissive, assessing, reducing it to something small enough to control. "Remove it," he said, and the words landed with a finality that seemed to settle into the grain of the wood itself, while the young defense attorney beside Martin, Daniel Price, straightened in his chair, hesitation flashing across his face as he glanced at his client, then back at the judge, as if weighing the risk of speaking against the certainty of being shut down. And somewhere in the back row, a man in a slightly oversized suit, Ethan Cole, paused mid-scroll on his phone, his attention pulled forward by something he couldn't quite name yet. Just a feeling, a quiet alarm that began to take shape as he focused on the old man at the front of the room. Because Martin Hale did not move, did not reach for the ribbon, did not argue, and did not look away. He simply remained exactly where he was, as if the command had passed over him like wind over stone. And in that stillness there was no defiance, no performance, only a calm that did not belong to this room, did not belong to fluorescent lights and legal jargon and impatient judges. A calm that felt older, heavier, earned in places far removed from polished benches and neat transcripts, and the judge's jaw tightened just slightly as he watched it, as if something in that silence unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "I won't repeat myself," Whitmore added, voice dropping, quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. "Take it off, or I will have it removed." And the room held its breath, not because anyone expected resistance, but because something in the air had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm breaks, when everything goes still, not out of peace, but because something far more powerful is about to arrive. Daniel Price cleared his throat, the sound small but deliberate in the tightening air, and he rose halfway from his chair, as if testing the weight of the moment before committing to it, his suit jacket pulling slightly at the shoulders. "Your Honor, if I may," he began, careful, respectful, choosing each word like stepping stones across uncertain ground. But Judge Whitmore did not even look at him, not fully, only enough to acknowledge the interruption as something inconvenient, something to be managed, and he lifted one hand with a subtle flick of his fingers, a gesture that carried more dismissal than any raised voice ever could. "You may not," the judge said flatly, and the words fell with a practiced authority that had silenced hundreds before, while Daniel hesitated, lips parting as if to try again, then closing as he glanced down at Martin Hale, searching for direction, for permission, for something, But Martin remained exactly as he had been, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, not on the judge now, but somewhere slightly beyond him, as if the man on the bench was only a small part of a much larger horizon, and that stillness did something strange to the room. It did not escalate the tension, it deepened it, turned it inward, made it heavier, until even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than it should have been, and the bailiff, Frank Dobbins, shifted again near the aisle, his eyes moving from the judge to the old man and back, uncertainty creeping into the lines of his face, because this was not how these moments usually went. People argued, protested, pleaded, they filled the space with noise, but this silence, this quiet refusal to engage on the expected terms, it unsettled the rhythm of the room in a way that procedure could not easily correct. "Sir," the judge continued, leaning forward once more, his patience thinning now into something sharper, "I am giving you a direct order. Remove the medal." And he emphasized the last word as though naming it reduced it, contained it, stripped it of whatever weight it might otherwise carry. But Martin's hand did not rise, did not even twitch toward the ribbon. Instead, his fingers curled slightly against the worn armrest of the chair, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but one that carried intention. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and entirely without strain, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be heard. "This medal does not come off," he said, and the sentence hung in the air with a clarity that cut through everything else. No defiance, no anger, just a statement of fact. And somewhere in the back row, Ethan Cole felt a chill trace up his spine, not from the words themselves, but from the way they were delivered, from the certainty behind them, because he had heard that tone before, not in courtrooms, but in quiet conversations at his father's dinner table, stories told by men who did not need to prove anything because they had already lived it. And he leaned forward slightly now, his attention fully locked, his earlier distraction gone, replaced by a growing sense that something important was unfolding in front of him, and that most of the room did not yet understand it. While at the bench, Judge Whitmore's expression hardened, the faintest flush rising along his collar as his authority met something it could not easily bend. "That is not your decision to make," he replied, each word clipped, controlled, but edged now with irritation that threatened to spill over. And he turned his head slightly toward the bailiff without fully breaking eye contact with Martin. "Mr. Dobbins," he said, the name carrying the weight of instruction before the command was even spoken, and the bailiff straightened instinctively, his training pulling him upright even as hesitation flickered in his eyes. "Assist the defendant in complying with the court's order," the judge finished, and the room seemed to contract around the sentence, every movement slowing, every breath measured, as Frank Dobbins took a single step forward, then another, the soft thud of his shoes against the floor echoing louder than they should have. And he approached not with aggression but with caution, as though he were stepping into something he did not fully understand. "Sir," he said quietly when he reached Martin's side, his voice lower now, almost respectful despite the instruction he carried, "let us not make this harder than it needs to be." But Martin did not look up at him immediately, his gaze still fixed somewhere beyond the bench, beyond the walls, and for a brief moment it felt as though the entire courtroom was waiting on a man who no longer belonged to it, waiting to see whether he would yield to its rules or remain anchored to something far older, far heavier, something that did not recognize this room as the final authority. Frank Dobbins stopped just short of reaching for the ribbon, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second before lowering again, and in that small hesitation something shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if even he understood that this was not a simple matter of procedure, not just another compliance to enforce, and he cleared his throat quietly, glancing once toward the bench for reassurance that the order still stood. But Judge Whitmore did not nod, did not soften, he simply watched, his gaze fixed and expectant, and that was enough. It always had been. Yet still the bailiff did not move immediately, because up close the medal did not look like decoration. It did not gleam with polished vanity or ceremonial pride. It carried a dull, worn finish, the kind that came from years rather than display, and the ribbon, slightly faded, rested against Martin Hale's chest with a weight that seemed far greater than its size, and For a brief moment the bailiff felt like an intruder standing too close to something he did not have the right to touch. "Sir," he said again, softer this time. Almost an appeal rather than a command. But Martin finally turned his head, not quickly, not defensively, just enough to meet the man's eyes. And there was no anger there, no resistance, only a calm that made the request itself seem out of place. As if the rules of this room had somehow overreached into territory they were never meant to govern, and that calm pressed outward, touching everything, the wood benches, the silent spectators, even the judge himself who now shifted slightly in his seat. The faint scrape of fabric against wood the only sign of movement at the bench. "We are not debating this," Whitmore said, his voice tightening, losing some of its earlier polish as irritation began to edge through. "This is a courtroom, not a shrine, and I will not allow symbolic theatrics to interfere with legal proceedings." And the word theatrics landed harder than he intended, not because of its volume, but because of its implication, reducing something deeply personal to something performative. And in the gallery a low murmur began to stir, quickly suppressed, but not entirely gone, like a current running beneath the surface, while Daniel Price shifted again beside Martin, his hand tightening around a stack of papers he no longer seemed to see, because the case itself had already slipped out of focus, replaced by something larger, something that had nothing to do with ordinances or filings or missed notices, and everything to do with respect, or the lack of it. And in the back Ethan Cole leaned forward further now, elbows resting lightly on his knees, his eyes locked onto the ribbon, onto the way it sat against the old man's chest. And something in his memory clicked, not a full recognition yet, but a shape, a pattern, a detail that did not belong in a courtroom like this unless it meant something far more significant. And he felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with realization forming just out of reach. While at the front Frank Dobbins finally exhaled, long and controlled, and made a decision that was not entirely his own, because the room demanded movement and the judge demanded compliance. And he reached out, slowly, deliberately, not grabbing, not forcing, but closing the distance between his hand and the ribbon. And just as his fingers hovered inches away, Martin's hand rose, not to block, not to push, but simply to rest over the metal, a quiet, unmistakable boundary. And the gesture was so controlled, so measured, that it stopped the motion without any need for force. And the bailiff froze there, his hand suspended in midair, because in that moment it became clear that this was not resistance in the way he understood it. This was something else entirely, something rooted in a place that did not bend to instructions given from a raised bench. And the silence that followed was deeper than before, heavier, as if the entire room had crossed an invisible line and was now waiting to see what would happen next, while Judge Whitmore's patience finally snapped into something colder, more rigid. "Enough," he said sharply, the word striking through the quiet like a gavel. "If you refuse to comply, I will have you held in contempt of court." And this time there was no attempt to soften the tone, no effort to maintain the earlier veneer, just authority asserting itself in its purest form. And yet even then Martin Hale did not react the way the judge expected, did not flinch, did not argue. He simply kept his hand where it was, resting over the metal, as if holding on to something far more important than anything this room could take away. The word contempt did not echo the way the judge expected it to. It did not crack through the room with authority or forced submission. Instead, it seemed to fall flat against the silence that had already taken hold. And for a brief moment, even Judge Whitmore appeared to register it, a flicker of something uncertain passing behind his eyes before it hardened again into resolve. Because authority, once challenged, rarely retreats, it doubles down. And he leaned forward once more, both hands now resting firmly on the bench, as if anchoring himself to the role he believed gave him control over everything within these walls. "Bailiff," he said again, sharper this time, "I gave you an order." And Frank Dobbins swallowed almost imperceptibly, his throat tightening as he looked from the judge back to Martin Hale. And something about the old man's hand resting over the metal held him there, suspended between instruction and instinct, because that hand was not defensive, it was not clenched or raised, it simply rested, steady and certain, as if it had been placed there long before this moment, and would remain long after it passed. and the simplicity of it made the act of removing the metal feel like something far larger than following a directive. It felt like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, and the air in the courtroom grew heavier still, pressing down in a way that made every movement feel deliberate, every sound amplified, until even the faint rustle of clothing in the gallery seemed intrusive, and Martin's fingers shifted slightly against the metal, just enough for the light above to catch the edge of the metal, a dull reflection, not bright, not polished, but worn in a way that spoke of time rather than display, and that small flicker of light was enough. It was all it took, because in that instant the courtroom, with its hard benches and fluorescent glow, seemed to recede, not physically but perceptually, as if it had been pushed back by something older, something deeper, and Martin's gaze dropped to where his hand rested. And for the first time since the exchange began, there was the faintest change in his expression, not visible to most, not dramatic, just a subtle tightening at the corner of his eyes, the kind that comes when memory surfaces without invitation, and the silence around him deepened, not empty, but filled with something unspoken, something carried from a different place entirely, a place where the air had not been still and the stakes had not been measured in rulings or orders, and though no one else in the room could see it, the shift was there, in the way Martin's posture settled just a fraction lower, in the way his breathing slowed, controlled, as if aligning with something beyond the present moment, and Ethan Cole felt it before he understood it, that same tightening in his chest sharpening into something clearer now, because the metal, the ribbon, the way the old man held it, none of it matched the judge's description, none of it felt like decoration, it felt like evidence of something real. Something earned in a way that could not be explained. Within the language of this room, and he leaned forward further, his phone now forgotten entirely, his attention fixed, searching his memory for confirmation, for context, for anything that could explain why this moment felt so wrong. While at the front, Judge Whitmore misread the silence entirely, interpreting it not as weight, but as resistance, as defiance that needed to be corrected, and his voice rose slightly, not loud, but sharper, edged with impatience that now bordered on anger. "This is your final warning," he said, each word clipped, deliberate. "Remove it, or I will have you detained immediately." And the threat hung there, heavy and unmistakable, but Martin did not look up, did not respond to the escalation. Instead, his thumb brushed once, lightly, across the surface of the metal, a small, almost absent motion, and in that single touch the present seemed to fracture just enough for something else to press through, something that did not belong to polished benches or controlled voices, something that carried weight not measured in authority but in memory. And though the room remained exactly as it was, unchanged in every visible way, it no longer felt like the center of the moment, because the center had shifted, anchored now to that small piece of metal, and the man who refused to let it be reduced to anything less than what it truly was. The fluorescent hum of the courtroom faded, not in sound but in weight, as if it no longer held authority over the moment, and Martin Hale's thumb rested against the edge of the metal with a familiarity that did not belong to this room, because the metal beneath his skin was not just an object, it was a memory anchored in something far colder, far harsher than polished wood and controlled voices. And for a fleeting second the rigid lines of courtroom 3B dissolved into something else entirely, the air shifting from stale and recycled to sharp and biting, the kind of cold that cut through fabric and settled deep into bone, where breath came out in slow, visible clouds, and every movement had consequence. And Martin was no longer an old man in a chair, but a young soldier standing on uneven ground, boots pressed into frozen earth that did not forgive hesitation. The sky above a pale gray expanse that offered no comfort and no cover, and the silence there had not been like this silence. It had not been controlled or procedural. It had been earned, carved out between moments where everything could change without warning, and the men around him had not spoken much either, not because they were told to be quiet, but because they understood what mattered and what did not. And in that place words were not currency, actions were, and Martin's breathing had been steady then, just as it was now, measured, deliberate, as if he had always known how to hold himself in the center of pressure without letting it break him. And the metal, the one resting now against his chest, had not existed yet, not as something tangible, but as a promise waiting to be made, a recognition not of perfection but of endurance, of holding a line when stepping back would have been easier, of choosing to remain when leaving would have been understood, and the memory did not come in fragments. It came in weight, in sensation, in the quiet understanding of what had been asked and what had been given in return, and then, as quickly as it had formed, the cold receded, the gray sky replaced once more by fluorescent light, the frozen ground by polished flooring, and Martin's eyes refocused, not startled, not shaken, but grounded, as if the past had not pulled him away but had instead reinforced where he stood, and the metal beneath his hand seemed heavier now, not physically, but in meaning, as though the distance between then and now had collapsed into a single point of clarity, and in the gallery Ethan Cole felt it fully for the first time, the recognition locking into place with a quiet certainty that sent a sharp pulse through his chest, because he had seen something like that metal before, not in person, not up close, but in framed photographs in his father's study, in stories told in careful tones about men who had done things that were never meant to be reduced to words, and his gaze sharpened, focusing on the details he had overlooked before, the ribbon's color, the shape of the metal, the way it was worn not as decoration but as something integral, something inseparable from the man himself, and a realization began to rise, slow but undeniable, that what was happening in this room was not just wrong, it was profoundly misplaced, and at the front Judge Whitmore, unaware of the shift unfolding around him, mistook the continued silence for defiance that needed to be corrected, his fingers tapping once more against the bench with controlled impatience, as if trying to reassert the rhythm he believed governed everything here. "I will not delay these proceedings any further," he said, his voice firm, edged with a frustration that now bordered on something more brittle. "This court will maintain order." And yet the order he spoke of no longer felt absolute, not in the way it had when the session began, because something older, something earned far beyond these walls, had entered the space, carried not by rank or announcement, but by memory, by presence, by the quiet refusal of a man who understood that some things were not subject to removal, not by command, not by law, not by anything that did not fully comprehend what it was asking to take away. Ethan Cole did not realize he was already on his feet until the wooden bench behind him creaked softly from the sudden absence of his weight, and the sound seemed louder than it should have been, sharp enough to cut through the heavy stillness that had settled over the room, and for a split second he froze, aware of every eye that might turn toward him, every rule he might be about to bend. But the feeling in his chest did not fade. It sharpened, clarified, and with it came something he had not expected to feel in a place like this. Not fear, not even urgency, but responsibility, quiet and insistent, the kind that does not ask for permission. And he glanced once toward the front where Martin Hale sat unmoving, his hand still resting over the metal, then toward the bench where Judge Whitmore watched the scene with controlled impatience. And Ethan understood in that instant that the room was operating on incomplete information, that something essential had not been recognized, and that the longer it went unrecognized, the worse the outcome would become, and he turned without announcing himself, moving toward the side aisle with measured steps that tried to remain inconspicuous but could not fully escape the weight of the moment, his shoes making soft contact with the polished floor, each step carrying him further from procedure, and closer to something that felt far more consequential. And as he reached the double doors at the back of the courtroom, he pushed one open just enough to slip through, the hinge giving a quiet, controlled creak before the door settled back into place behind him, muting the tension inside to a distant, contained pressure, and the hallway beyond felt cooler, quieter, the overhead lights casting long, pale reflections along the tiled floor. And for a moment Ethan stood there, drawing a steady breath, organizing the fragments in his mind into something actionable, because recognition alone was not enough. It needed to be confirmed. It needed to be carried to someone who would understand its weight, and his hand moved quickly to his phone, fingers unlocking it with practiced motion as he scrolled through contacts that suddenly felt more significant than they had just minutes ago. And he stopped on a name that carried a quiet authority of its own, Colonel James Hayes, a man who had served with his father, a man who did not entertain speculation but responded to clarity, and Ethan hesitated only once, not from doubt, but from the awareness that what he was about to say would set something in motion that could not easily be undone. Then he pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear, the line ringing once, twice, before a steady voice answered, controlled, alert, Hayes. And Ethan did not waste time with pleasantries, his words coming measured but urgent. Sir, this is Ethan Cole. I am at the county courthouse downtown. There is a man here, Martin Hale, and I believe there has been a mistake. There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, but focus, a recalibration as the name settled. Say that name again, Hayes said, quieter now, and Ethan felt the confirmation begin to take shape even before he repeated it. Martin Hale, sir, he is being ordered to remove a medal, and the situation is escalating. The silence that followed was different this time, not empty but charged, and when Hayes spoke again his tone had shifted, sharpened with something that carried far beyond a simple inquiry. Stay where you are, he said, each word precise. Do not let them proceed if you can help it. And the line clicked off with no further explanation, no reassurance, only instruction, and Ethan lowered the phone slowly, the hallway suddenly feeling smaller, more contained, because whatever had just been set into motion was already moving faster than he could follow. And back inside the courtroom the tension had not eased. It had only tightened, stretched thin by authority pressing against something it did not fully understand, and though no one in that room knew it yet, the balance had already begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but with the quiet certainty of something that had been recognized and was now on its way. Inside the courtroom the air had tightened to the point where even small movements felt amplified, and Judge Whitmore, unaware of the shift unfolding beyond the walls, mistook the stillness for hesitation rather than consequence, and he leaned back in his chair with a measured exhale, gathering what remained of his patience into something colder, more procedural. Very well, he said, his voice flattening into a tone that carried the weight of decision rather than discussion. If the defendant refuses to comply with a direct order of this court, then we will proceed accordingly. And he reached for the small wooden gavel resting near his right hand, his fingers closing around it with practiced ease, the motion familiar, controlled, the kind that had ended countless arguments before they had a chance to escalate. And yet as he lifted it slightly the room did not respond the way it usually did, no immediate shift, no release of tension, only a deeper, heavier quiet that seemed to resist resolution, and Daniel Price felt it from where he stood beside Martin Hale, his thoughts racing now, searching for anything he could say that would not be dismissed, any angle that would slow the momentum building at the bench, but the structure of the room was against him. Every word filtered through authority that had already made its judgment, and he glanced once more at Martin, hoping for some sign, some instruction, but the old man remained unchanged, his hand still resting over the medal, his posture steady, as if the outcome unfolding before him was not something to be feared, but something to be endured. And that calm unsettled Daniel more than any raised voice could have, because it suggested a certainty he did not yet understand. While near the aisle Frank Dobbins shifted again, his stance no longer as firm as it had been at the beginning of the session, his weight subtly uneven as if he were balancing between duty and doubt, and he looked toward the judge, waiting for the next command, knowing it would come, knowing he would be expected to act on it, yet feeling the quiet resistance of the moment pressing back against him. And in the gallery the low murmur that had been suppressed earlier threatened to return, small movements, exchanged glances, the subtle language of people recognizing that something had crossed a line they could not clearly define but could unmistakably feel. And still Judge Whitmore pressed forward, his voice sharpening as he set the gavel down again without striking it, choosing instead to escalate with words rather than sound. Mr. Hale, I am ordering you, for the final time, to remove that item immediately. And the emphasis he placed on item was deliberate, stripping it of identity, reducing it to something manageable within the confines of the courtroom. And for a brief second it seemed as though the entire room leaned forward, waiting, anticipating a break, a reaction, something that would restore the expected order. But Martin did not move, did not respond, his gaze lifting just slightly now, not to challenge, not to argue, but to meet the space in front of him with the same quiet steadiness that had defined him from the beginning. And that stillness, That refusal to engage on the judge's terms created a gap that authority alone could not bridge, and the tension stretched thinner, tighter, as if the room itself were holding its breath. And just beyond the closed doors at the back of the courtroom, footsteps began to echo faintly down the hallway, measured, deliberate, the sound of polished shoes striking tile with a rhythm that did not belong to hurried staff or uncertain visitors, but to something far more precise, far more controlled. And, though no one inside had yet turned to hear it, the presence carried with it a shift that was already beginning to press against the boundaries of the room. Something approaching not with noise or urgency, but with the kind of quiet authority that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And as the footsteps drew closer, the balance of the moment, so long held in tension, began to tip in a direction no one inside had anticipated. The sound reached the room before the presence did, a steady cadence of footsteps that did not hurry, did not hesitate, each one landing with a precision that seemed to carry its own authority, and one by one heads began to turn toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom, not because anyone had been instructed to, but because something about the rhythm demanded attention, and Judge Whitmore paused mid-breath. The next words he had been about to deliver caught and held as the door opened with a controlled, deliberate motion, not slammed, not forced, simply opened as if it had every right to do so. And the hallway light spilled briefly into the room before being cut by the figures that stepped through, 3 of them, aligned not by chance but by habit, their uniforms crisp, their posture exact, the quiet precision of military presence filling the space in a way that no raised voice ever could. And at the center of them walked General Thomas Keegan, his expression composed, his eyes forward, not scanning the room for approval or reaction, but fixed on a single point ahead, and the effect was immediate. The subtle murmur that had been building in the gallery vanished completely, replaced by a silence so complete it felt intentional, as if the room itself had chosen to stand at attention, and even the air seemed to shift, the stale stillness replaced by something sharper, more defined. And Judge Whitmore straightened unconsciously, his hand tightening slightly. Around the edge of the bench, the authority he had held moments before suddenly feeling less absolute, not removed, but challenged by something that operated on a different axis entirely. And General Keegan did not acknowledge him, not yet, did not look to the bench, did not ask for permission to enter or speak. He simply walked forward, each step measured, the polished leather of his shoes, striking the floor with a sound that carried cleanly through the silence. And Frank Dobbins instinctively stepped back, clearing the space without being told, his body responding to a presence he recognized even if he did not fully understand it. While Daniel Price stood frozen beside the defense table, his thoughts momentarily suspended as he watched the approach. And in the gallery, Ethan Cole remained just inside the doorway, his breath held without realizing it, because this was the moment. His call had set into motion, and it had arrived faster, stronger, and more absolute than he had anticipated. And at the center of it all, Martin Hale did not move, not as the general approached, not as the room shifted around him. He remained exactly as he had been, his hand resting over the metal, his posture steady, as if this arrival was not a surprise but an inevitability. And when General Keegan reached him, he stopped, not abruptly, not with flourish, but with a controlled halt that marked the end of movement and the beginning of something else. And for a brief second the two men simply existed in the same space, the distance between them measured not in feet, but in shared understanding. And then, without a word, without hesitation, General Keegan straightened fully and raised his hand in a precise, unmistakable salute, the motion sharp, exact, held with a respect that did not need explanation. And the effect was immediate and absolute. The entire courtroom froze, not metaphorically, but truly, as if every person inside had been caught between one breath and the next, unable to move, unable to speak, because the meaning of that single gesture carried more weight than anything that had been said in the room all day. And in that silence, the balance of power shifted completely, not through argument, not through authority declared, but through recognition, through respect, through the quiet, undeniable truth that had finally stepped into the light. General Thomas Keegan held the salute for a measured moment longer than protocol required, not out of formality, but out of recognition. the kind that could not be rushed or reduced to routine. And when he finally lowered his hand, it was done with the same precision, the same control, as if every movement carried intention, and only then did he turn, slowly, deliberately, to face the bench, and the shift was immediate, because now the weight that had entered the room was no longer contained between two men who understood it. It was directed outward, toward the authority that had failed to recognize it, and Judge Whitmore, who had presided over countless proceedings with absolute confidence, found himself adjusting in his seat in a way that felt unfamiliar, his posture straightening not from habit but from awareness, his grip on the edge of the bench tightening slightly as he recalibrated. Because the rules he knew still applied, but the context had changed, and he understood, even before a word was spoken, that he was no longer the highest authority in the room in the way he had assumed, and General Keegan's voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and entirely without aggression, yet it carried with it a clarity that cut through everything else. "Your Honor," he said, acknowledging the position but not yielding to it. "The individual seated before you is Master Sergeant Martin. Hail, United States Army, retired." And the title settled into the room with a quiet finality, not announced for effect, but stated as fact, and a ripple moved through the gallery, subtle but undeniable, as recognition began to spread, piece by piece, detail by detail, until the earlier confusion gave way to understanding, and the general continued, not raising his voice, not elaborating beyond what was necessary. "The medal you have referred to as an item is not a decoration for display. It is a record of service that cannot be separated from the man who earned it." And he paused, not for dramatic effect, but to allow the words to land fully, to settle into the space that had previously dismissed them, and Judge Whitmore's expression shifted, the certainty that had defined him earlier giving way to something more restrained, more careful, as he processed what was being said. And for the first time since the session began, he looked not at the medal as an object to be managed, but at the man wearing it, and what he saw there did not align with the assumptions he had made, and that realization carried weight, not loud, not immediate, but steady and impossible to ignore. While beside him Daniel Price exhaled slowly, tension releasing from his shoulders as the situation, once slipping beyond his control, realigned itself with a clarity he had not been able to create on his own. And near the aisle Frank Dobbins stepped back another pace, his role no longer uncertain, because the need for action had dissolved, replaced by something that required only acknowledgement. And in the back Ethan Cole remained still, his earlier decision now fully realized in front of him, not with chaos or confrontation, but with the quiet correction of a mistake that had nearly gone too far. And at the center of it all, Martin Hale finally lifted his gaze, not to challenge, not to seek validation, but simply to meet the moment as it now stood, unchanged in his composure, unchanged in his presence, as if nothing about him had shifted at all, because in truth it had not. It was the room that had changed, the understanding within it, the recognition that had arrived not through argument but through truth, and the silence that followed was no longer tense, no longer uncertain. It was something else entirely, something heavier, something closer to respect. And in that silence the weight of what had almost been lost, almost been dismissed, settled over everyone present, not as accusation, but as reminder. And though no formal ruling had yet been spoken, no gavel struck to mark the conclusion, the outcome was already clear, because some things do not require enforcement to be understood, they require only the right moment, the right presence, and the willingness to recognize what should never have been questioned in the first place. And as the room remained still, held in that quiet acknowledgement, one truth stood above the rest, steady and unshaken, that respect is not granted by position, it is revealed by understanding, and once seen, it cannot be taken back.